Let me tell you what it feels like to freeze to death. It doesn't start with cold. Not really. It starts with shivering. Your body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. Uncontrollable tremors that rack your entire frame. Teeth chattering so hard you worry they might crack. This goes on for hours. You can't stop it. Your body is fighting for its life, burning through energy reserves at an alarming rate, trying to maintain that precious 98.6 degrees that keeps you alive. And then, something worse. The shivering stops, not because you're warming up, because your body has given up. It's abandoned the extremities now, your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears. Blood retreats to the core, a desperate last stand to protect the vital organs. Your hands turn white, then blue. You can't feel them anymore, can't move them. They might as well belong to someone else. Confusion sets in. Your brain, starving for warmth, begins to malfunction. Simple thoughts become impossible. You forget where you are. You forget why you came here. You forget your own name. And then comes the strangest part, the part that kills more people than any other. You start to feel warm. It's a lie, the cruelest lie your dying body can tell you. As your core temperature drops below 90 degrees, the blood vessels near your skin suddenly dilate. Warm blood rushes to the surface, and you feel, for the first time in hours, genuinely comfortable. This is when people take off their clothes. Rescuers find them that way, half naked in the snow, faces almost peaceful, frozen in the act of removing the very garments that might have saved them. They call it paradoxical undressing. Your body, in its final moments, convinces you that you're burning up, and then you want to sleep. More than anything you've ever wanted in your life. Just lie down. Just close your eyes. Just rest for a moment. You don't wake up. This is how people died for thousands of years. This is the death that stalked every village, every family, every child who wandered too far from the fire. This is who Jack Frost really was. We've lost our sense of how deadly winter used to be. So let me give you some numbers. The Great Frost of 1709. A cold snap that descended on Europe and refused to leave. The Baltic Sea froze solid. Venice's canals turned to ice. In France alone, an estimated 600,000 people died in a single season. 600,000. That's more than the population of most modern cities, erased by cold in a matter of months. The winter of 1783 to 1784. A volcanic eruption in Iceland had dimmed the sun, and temperatures plummeted across the northern hemisphere. In England, the death toll spiked so sharply that parishes ran out of space in their graveyards. They dug mass graves. They buried the frozen dead in layers. The Little Ice Age, a period stretching from roughly 1300 to 1850, brought centuries of elevated mortality. Crops failed, rivers froze. The Thames in London became a winter fairground because the ice was thick enough to hold crowds. We remember the frost fairs now as quaint historical curiosities. We forget the people who froze to death in the streets while the wealthy skated nearby. These weren't anomalies. These were just the peaks of an endless annual assault. In pre-industrial Europe, infant mortality spiked every winter. If your child was born in autumn, the odds of them seeing spring were significantly lower than if they'd been born in May. The elderly died in their beds when the fire went out. Travelers died on roads they'd walked 100 times before. Farmers died in their own fields, caught by a storm that came faster than expected. Winter wasn't a season, it was a siege, and every year it extracted its toll in human lives. This is the world that created Jack Frost. Not a sprite, not a cartoon. A god of death that arrived on schedule every November and didn't leave until it had taken its share. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the terrors our ancestors faced should not be lost to comfortable modern ignorance, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit. It allows us to keep exploring the shadows where history and horror intertwine. Every view, every subscription, every share helps us dig deeper into the past that others would prefer to forget. Tonight, we will step into the frozen forests of ancient Russia. We will follow a girl abandoned by her father, left to die in the killing cold. We will meet the spirit that tested her, the god of winter who asked a question that determined whether she lived or died. But this is not just one story. We will trace the many faces of frost across cultures and centuries. From the survival guide hidden in a Russian fairy tale, to the Norse giants who waited at the edge of the world to end it in ice. From the Slavic demons who demanded offerings of frozen food, to the English sprite we've made safe for Christmas cards. From Dead Moroz, the grandfather of winter who used to freeze disobedient children, to Jack Frost, the cute cartoon who paints windows. We will ask why our ancestors feared winter so deeply. We will look at the numbers, the death tolls, the famines, the frozen graves that filled every spring when the thaw revealed what the cold had taken. And we will meet the humans in this story, not just the supernatural figures, but the ordinary people who enabled extraordinary horror. A father who abandoned his daughter, a stepmother who sent her own child to die, the weak men and cruel women who populate our darkest tales and our darkest histories. This is not only the story of a monster, it is the story of what our ancestors feared most. It is the story of how they survived and what that survival cost them. It is the question that winter asks all living things every year without fail. Are you warm enough? To understand that question, we must first understand what winter really meant. Before central heating, before insulated walls, before the safety we take for granted, we must go back to a time when the cold could kill you in your own home, in your own bed, while your family slept beside you. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Russia, centuries ago, a small village on the edge of an endless forest. In a wooden house that groaned against the winter wind lived a family. A widower who had remarried, his daughter from his first wife, a girl we'll call Nastya, as some versions of this story do, his new wife, and her daughter from a previous marriage, Marfusha, 2 girls, same age, same house, same cold winters, pressing against the same thin walls, treated completely differently. Nastya was her father's daughter in name only. The moment his new wife crossed the threshold, Nastya became something else entirely. A servant, a burden, an unwanted reminder of a dead woman whose ghost still haunted the house. She woke before dawn to light the fires. She hauled water from the frozen well, her hands cracking and bleeding in the cold. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended, she scrubbed. Her back ached constantly. Her fingers were always numb. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been truly warm. And through it all, she never complained. She'd learned early that complaints only made things worse, that the stepmother's punishments were creative and cruel, that her father, weak-willed and desperate for peace, would never intervene on her behalf. So she worked, and she was silent, and she survived. Marfusha, meanwhile, did nothing. She slept until noon while Nastya scrubbed floors in the cold. She ate the best portions of every meal while Nastya got the scraps. She sat by the fire, always by the fire, the warmest spot in the house, while her stepsister shivered through her endless chores. She was lazy, spoiled, and utterly convinced that the world existed to serve her comfort. Her mother had taught her this, had raised her to believe she was special, that she deserved ease, that hardship was something that happened to other people like Nastya. It would be easy to make the stepmother a cartoon villain, a wicked woman who hates her stepdaughter for no reason, existing only to drive the plot toward tragedy. But real monsters are more complicated than that. The stepmother had reasons for what she did, not good reasons. There are no good reasons for what she did, but human ones, understandable ones, in the twisted way that human cruelty is always understandable when you look closely enough. She was a second wife. In that time and place, that meant something specific. She'd come into a household where another woman's ghost still lingered, where her husband's first love had left behind a living reminder, a daughter with her mother's eyes, her mother's face, her mother's claim on his heart. Every time the man looked at Nastya, did he see his new wife, or did he see the woman he'd buried? The stepmother didn't know. She could never be sure, and that uncertainty curdled into resentment, and resentment into hatred. There were practical concerns too. Resources were limited. Every mouth had to be fed. Every body had to be clothed. Every person had to be kept alive through the winter. And here was this girl, this ghost's daughter, consuming food and firewood that could go to her own child. Inheritance mattered as well. What little the family had would pass to the man's children, to Nastya, not to Marfusha, who wasn't his blood, unless Nastya wasn't there to inherit. The stepmother looked at her stepdaughter and saw a threat, saw competition, saw an obstacle between her daughter and security. She told herself she was protecting Marfusha, told herself she was doing what any mother would do. She told herself whatever she needed to tell herself to justify what she was planning. The stepmother was patient. She understood that her husband, for all his weakness, still harbored some vestigial affection for his daughter. She couldn't simply demand the girl's death. She had to make him want it. So she began her campaign. Every day, a new complaint whispered into his ear. The girl was lazy. Look at how slowly she works, how carelessly she does her chores. The girl was eating too much. We can barely afford to feed ourselves, and she takes more than her share. The girl was ungrateful. After everything we've done for her, she shows us no respect. The girl was a curse. Bad luck clings to her like a shadow. Have you noticed how things have gotten harder since her mother died? How the harvests have been worse? How the winters have been colder? Maybe it's her. Maybe she brought this on us. The man defended his daughter at first, weakly, half-heartedly, but he defended her. She's just a child. She does her best. She's all I have left of her mother. But he was tired. So tired of fighting. So tired of the constant tension that filled his house like smoke. So tired of sleeping next to a woman whose body went rigid with anger whenever he took his daughter's side. The stepmother wore him down. Week by week, month by month, complaint by complaint, until his defenses crumbled and he simply stopped arguing. And then she made her demand explicit. Take her into the forest. Leave her there. Let the cold deal with her. The man knew what his wife was asking. He wasn't stupid, just weak. The forest in winter was death. No shelter, no fire, no food. Temperatures that would kill a grown man in hours. His daughter wouldn't survive the night. He could have refused. Could have finally, after years of capitulation, stood up for his child. Could have been the father she needed. But that would have meant conflict. That would have meant his wife's fury, her icy silences, her ability to make his life miserable in 1,000 small ways. That would have been hard. And the man had spent his entire life avoiding hard things. So he agreed. He told himself it wasn't really murder. His hands wouldn't touch her. No weapon would be involved. It was the cold that would kill her. The forest. Nature. He was just leaving her somewhere. What happened after that wasn't his responsibility. This is what cowards tell themselves. This is the logic that enables atrocity, the careful distancing, the passive voice, the refusal to connect cause and effect. He wouldn't kill his daughter. He would simply put her in a situation where she would die. And somehow, in his mind, that was different. History is full of men like this. Men who enable horror through their weakness. Who stand aside while others commit the acts they're too squeamish to perform themselves. Who tell themselves they're innocent because they never held the knife. The father was worse than the stepmother, in a way. She at least was honest about what she wanted. He pretended he wasn't doing what he was doing, even as he did it. He agreed to murder his daughter, and he told himself he hadn't. The next morning before dawn, the man woke his daughter. Nastya rose immediately. She always did. Obedience was instinct now, survival reflex. When someone with power over you tells you to do something, you do it without question. Hesitation brings punishment. Questions bring worse. Get dressed, he said, warmly. We're going on a journey. She didn't ask where, didn't ask why. She simply did as she was told, pulling on her thin coat, the only coat she had, patched and repatched until it was more thread than fabric, and following her father out into the darkness. The sleigh was already prepared. 1 horse, old and tired, room for 2. They rode in silence. The man couldn't look at his daughter, couldn't make small talk, couldn't pretend this was anything other than what it was. Every word would have been a lie, and even he couldn't sustain that many lies at once. The forest swallowed them. If you've never seen a Russian forest in winter, you cannot understand how vast it is, how empty, how utterly devoid of mercy. The trees stretch in every direction, endless columns of black against the grey sky. The snow lies thick and pristine, unmarked by human passage. The silence is absolute. No birds, no animals, nothing but the creak of frozen branches and the whisper of wind through dead leaves. People disappeared in forests like this. Hunters who knew every trail, travelers who had made the journey 100 times. One wrong turn, one moment of confusion, and the forest claimed you. They'd find your body in the spring, if they found it at all. The man drove deeper, past any landmark Nastya might recognize. past any hope of finding her way back. Finally, he stopped. A clearing, a single large tree, nothing else for miles. "Get out," he said. She obeyed. "Wait here," he said. He pointed at the tree. "I'll be back." Nastya stood in the snow, looked at her father, saw something in his face she'd never seen before, guilt mixed with relief. The expression of a man who was doing something unforgivable and knew it and had decided to do it anyway. She understood then. Maybe she'd understood from the moment he woke her. Maybe she'd spent her whole life preparing for this moment without knowing it. Her father wasn't coming back. She watched the sleigh pull away, watched her father hunch over the reins, refusing to look back, watched until the trees swallowed him and the sound of hooves faded and she was alone, completely alone. In a frozen forest, in the dead of winter, with nothing but a threadbare coat between her and the killing cold. She was meant to die here. Nastya stood in the clearing for a long time. The cold was already working on her, seeping through the thin coat, finding every gap, every worn patch, every place where the fabric had grown too threadbare to offer any protection. Her fingers ached. Her toes had gone numb. Each breath burned her lungs with a sharp, crystalline pain. She could run. She could try to follow the sleigh tracks back toward the village. The snow would hold the marks for a while, at least until the wind erased them or fresh snowfall covered them over. Maybe she could make it. Maybe she'd find someone else. Another village, a hunting cabin, anyone who might take pity on a frozen girl. But she knew better. She was miles from anywhere, hours of walking at least, even if she could move fast. And she couldn't move fast, not in this cold, not with her strength already fading, not without food or proper clothing or any real hope of survival. She'd collapse before she made it halfway, die alone somewhere in the snow, just as her stepmother intended. Running was just a slower way of dying. So she didn't run. She didn't scream or rage or curse her father. She didn't cry, though perhaps she would have if her tears wouldn't have frozen on her face. She didn't call out for help, because there was no one to hear her. She sat down beneath the tree, pulled her coat tight around her, and waited. Maybe she was in shock. The mind has ways of protecting itself from horror, shutting down emotional responses when they become too much to bear. Maybe she'd been so thoroughly broken by years of abuse that she'd lost the capacity to fight. Her whole life had been about endurance, about surviving one day at a time. This was just another day to survive. Or maybe, and this is what the old storytellers believed, maybe she understood something that most people don't. Some forces cannot be fought. Winter doesn't negotiate. Cold doesn't care about your rage or your pleas or your desperate desire to live. You can't argue with nature. You can't demand that the world be different than it is. The only choice is how you meet it. The day wore on. The weak winter sun crawled across the grey sky, offering no warmth, only the knowledge that time was passing, that darkness was coming, that once night fell, whatever slim chance she had would vanish entirely. Nastya's body was shutting down. She could feel it, the numbness spreading from her hands and feet toward her center, the confusion creeping into her thoughts, making it hard to remember why she was here, what she was waiting for, whether any of this was real. She was dying, slowly but certainly. The cold was patient. It had all the time in the world. And then something changed. The forest went silent, not quiet, silent. The wind that had been whispering through the trees stopped. The distant call of a winter bird cut off mid-note. Even the creak and groan of frozen branches ceased, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Nastia looked up. The animals were moving. She could see them now, shapes in the distant trees. Deer, foxes, rabbits. Things that should have been hidden, that should have been sheltering from the cold. They were running, away from something, away from the direction she was facing. The temperature dropped. She thought she knew cold. She'd been cold her entire life. Cold in her stepmother's house. Cold doing chores. Cold sleeping in the worst spot away from the fire. But this was different. This was cold as a physical force, a presence, a weight pressing down on the world. Frost began to spread across the ground. She watched it. Intricate patterns racing outward from some point she couldn't see, crystallizing the snow, coating the bark of trees, turning the world into glass. And then she heard it, cracking, snapping, the sound of trees breaking under impossible weight. Coming closer, something was walking through the forest toward her, something that made the cold itself intensify with every step it took. He emerged from the forest like winter itself had decided to take human form. Morozko, Father Frost. The stories describe him differently depending on who tells them. Some say he was an old man, ancient beyond reckoning, with a beard like drifted snow and skin tinged blue from the cold that lived inside him. Others say he was a figure made entirely of ice, translucent and terrible, who creaked and groaned when he moved like a glacier, carving into the sea. Some say he had no fixed form at all, that he was simply cold given consciousness, a presence rather than a person, wearing whatever shape the observer's mind could comprehend. What they all agree on is what he felt like, cold. The temperature, already deadly, dropped further as he approached. The air itself seemed to freeze in his presence, moisture crystallizing instantly, breath turning to ice before it left your lips. This wasn't natural cold. This was something older, something that had existed before the sun, before fire, before warmth itself. He moved through the trees toward the clearing. Each step left frost spreading outward from his feet, killing any vegetation that still clung to life beneath the snow. The branches above him grew heavy with ice. The world itself seemed to contract around him, shrinking away from his presence. Nastia watched him approach. She should have been afraid, should have screamed or run or begged for mercy. Any sane person would have. This was clearly not human, not anymore, if it ever had been. This was a force of nature given consciousness. Death made manifest. But Nastia was beyond fear now. The cold had taken that from her, along with everything else. She simply watched, with eyes that could barely focus anymore, as this impossible figure stopped before her. He looked down at the dying girl huddled in the snow. His eyes were pale, colorless, like ice over deep water. You could see into them, but only a little way. Beyond that, darkness. He studied her for a long moment, and then he spoke. "Are you warm, my child?" The question hung in the frozen air. Are you warm? She should have told the truth. Should have said she was freezing, dying, beyond any hope of salvation. Should have begged this creature, whatever it was, for help, for mercy, for a quick death at least. But something stayed her tongue. Some instinct, buried deep, some memory of her mother's voice perhaps, from before she died, teaching her daughter the old ways, the old stories, the rules for dealing with forces beyond human understanding. Or maybe it was simply the survival reflex she'd developed over years of living with her stepmother. The knowledge that sometimes the wrong answer gets you killed, That power doesn't want to hear your complaints. That beings who can destroy you must be placated, flattered, told what they want to hear. "Yes, Father Frost," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. The cold had stolen most of it. "I'm warm enough. Thank you for asking." He studied her, those pale, depthless eyes revealing nothing. Then he breathed. The cold intensified beyond anything she'd felt before. The wind rose from nowhere, driving ice and snow into her face. The temperature plummeted into ranges that should have killed her instantly, that would have killed anyone not already half frozen into a state beyond normal human sensation. Every nerve in her body screamed. This was death. This was worse than death. This was the cold that existed before the sun, the primordial frost that had covered the universe before light and heat pushed it back. Father Frost watched her suffer. "And now?" he asked. "Are you warm now, child?" Her lips were blue. Her hands had lost all feeling. Every breath was agony, the frozen air cutting her lungs like broken glass. "Yes, Father Frost," she gasped. "Warm enough?" Again, he made it colder. Again, he asked the question. Again, she gave the same answer. 3 times this happened. 3 times she should have died and didn't. 3 times she looked into the face of winter itself and lied, told the god of cold that she was comfortable while he tried to kill her. What was going through her mind during the test? The story doesn't tell us. Stories like this rarely concern themselves with interiority. They show us actions and consequences, not the psychology that connects them. But we can imagine. Perhaps she was barely conscious at all. The cold does that, shuts down the thinking mind, reduces everything to instinct and reflex. Perhaps she answered correctly not because of any conscious choice, but because her body, in its dying moments, defaulted to the survival strategies she'd practiced her entire life. Say the right thing. Don't complain. Don't show weakness. Smile through the pain. Or perhaps she was fully aware. Perhaps she understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the edge of death, exactly what was happening. A test. A trial. An ancient being evaluating her worthiness to survive. And perhaps she knew what the test was really measuring. Not politeness, not gratitude, not any of the sanitized virtues that later retellings would emphasize. Endurance. The ability to suffer without breaking, to face the unfightable without wasting energy on futile resistance. To accept reality as it was, not as she wished it would be. This is what her stepmother had taught her, ironically. Years of abuse had trained her perfectly for this moment. She knew how to be hurt without showing it, how to swallow her complaints, how to maintain a pleasant facade while dying inside. Father Frost wasn't testing her character. He was testing her survival instincts. And she passed because her life had been nothing but survival for as long as she could remember. Is that a triumph? Or is it a tragedy? The story doesn't say. It simply tells us that she answered correctly 3 times, and that was enough. She had earned the right to live. Finally, Father Frost stopped. The wind died. The temperature, still deadly, still far below anything a human should survive, stabilized. The assault was over. Something shifted in his ancient face. Not warmth. Beings like Father Frost don't feel warmth, have never known it, exist in fundamental opposition to it. But something else. Satisfaction, perhaps. Recognition of something he valued. He had tested her, and she had passed. Not because she was brave. She wasn't. Not really. She was terrified, had been terrified from the moment he emerged from the trees. Not because she was strong. Her body was failing, had been failing since her father abandoned her. She passed because she understood something essential about the nature of power. You don't complain to the cold. You don't rage against winter. You don't demand that forces beyond your control be different than they are. You endure. You accept. You survive if you can. And if you can't, you meet your end without giving death the satisfaction of seeing you break. Father Frost reached into the air, or maybe the air itself reached back and drew forth a bundle of furs. Thick, heavy furs that seemed to materialize from the snow itself. The kind of furs that would cost more than Nastia's father earned in a decade. Wolf, bear, sable. Layers of warmth so profound that she gasped when they touched her frozen skin. He wrapped them around her. Then he placed beside her a chest, ornate, heavy, covered in frost that glittered like diamonds in the fading light. He opened it, and even through her fading vision, Nastia could see what lay inside. Gold, silver, jewels of every color. Treasures beyond anything her village had ever seen, beyond anything her father could have imagined in his most ambitious dreams. "You have answered well," Father Frost said. "Take these gifts. Go home. Live." He turned and walked back into the forest, and as he went, the cold went with him, retreating, releasing its grip, returning to the natural levels of a winter night, deadly still, but survivable now, normal. Nastia sat in the snow, wrapped in impossible furs, surrounded by impossible wealth. She had passed the test. She was going to live. The story usually skips what happens next. Father Frost leaves, and then, cut to morning, cut to the father's return, cut to the happy ending. But Nastia spent the whole night in that forest. Think about that. Think about what those hours must have been like. She was wrapped in warm furs now. Yes, she had treasure beside her. The supernatural cold had retreated. But she was still alone in a forest miles from anywhere, in the dark, surrounded by wolves and bears and all the other predators that hunted these woods. The fire she didn't have. The shelter she couldn't build. The complete and utter solitude of a girl who had just looked death in the face, and somehow, miraculously, impossibly, survived. And she knew now with absolute certainty that her father had tried to kill her. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you process the fact that the man who raised you, the man whose blood runs in your veins, deliberately left you to die? That he drove away without looking back, planning to return for your corpse? She must have replayed the moment over and over. His face as he told her to wait, the way he avoided her eyes, the guilt that flickered across his features before he smothered it. Had he hesitated? Had he considered, even for a moment, changing his mind? Or had he simply been impatient to get home, to be done with this unpleasant task, to move on with his life as if she'd never existed? The furs kept her body warm, but what kept her mind from breaking? Maybe nothing. Maybe she sat there all night, staring into the darkness, waiting for dawn, feeling nothing at all because feeling anything would have destroyed her. The numbness of shock, protecting her from a truth too terrible to process. Or maybe she wept. Finally, alone in the dark, where no one could see her weakness, where no one could punish her for having feelings. Maybe She let herself feel what she'd been forbidden to feel her entire life. The grief, the rage, the betrayal, the howling unfairness of a world where fathers murder daughters and stepmothers get what they want, and the only way to survive is to pretend you're not suffering. The story doesn't tell us. It doesn't care about her inner life, only her outer triumph. She survived. She was rewarded. That's supposed to be enough. But all night, she was alone with her thoughts, with the knowledge of what her family really was, with the question of what she would do when morning came and she had to face them again, with the treasure that couldn't buy back her innocence, and the furs that couldn't warm the cold place where her trust used to be. The longest night of her life, and no one to share it with. Morning came. The sun rose, weak and pale, but present. Light filtered through the trees. The forest, which had seemed so hostile in the darkness, became merely cold, merely dangerous, merely a place she shouldn't be. Nastia waited. The furs kept her warm. The treasure sat beside her, gleaming dully in the early light. And eventually, she heard it. The sound of a sleigh, the crunch of snow under hooves. Her father, returning to the clearing. He came to collect a corpse. She watched him approach, saw the moment he realized she was alive, the shock on his face, the stutter in his movements, the way his mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. He'd expected to find his daughter frozen under the tree. He'd probably rehearsed what he'd do, the grief he'd perform, the tears he'd manufacture, the story he'd tell the village. A tragic accident. She wandered off. By the time I found her, it was too late. Instead, here she was, sitting upright, healthy, dressed in furs that cost more than everything he owned, beside a chest of treasure that could buy the entire village twice over. He didn't ask how, didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what he'd done or what she must have endured. He just stared, and then his eyes moved to the treasure, and something shifted in his face. Greed replacing shock, calculation replacing confusion. "We should go home," he said finally. "No, I'm sorry. No, how did you survive? No, are you all right? Just, we should go home." And by we, he meant the treasure. He loaded the chest into the sleigh, helped Nastia up beside him, and drove back toward the village in complete silence. Father and daughter, neither speaking, neither able to speak. What was there to say? The village was small. Everyone knew everyone's business. So when the sleigh came rolling back with Nastia alive and well, dressed in furs and sitting beside a treasure chest, people noticed. But no one asked questions. Not out loud. This was Russia. This was winter. Strange things happened, and if you were smart, you didn't look too closely at miracles. You just accepted them and moved on. The stepmother was waiting at the door. Her face went through several transformations as they approached. First, shock, raw and unguarded, because she hadn't expected to have to guard against anything. Nastia was supposed to be dead. The cold was supposed to have done its work. Then, fury. The plan had failed. All that careful manipulation, all that patient work to convince her husband to do what needed to be done, wasted. And then, as her husband began unloading the chest, as the gold and jewels caught the morning light, greed. Her eyes went wide. Her hands trembled. She forgot entirely about hating Nastia, forgot about the murder plot, forgot about everything except the fortune that had somehow materialized from the frozen forest. Nastya watched her stepmother transform, watched the hatred melt into avarice, watched the woman who had tried to kill her start calculating how to profit from her survival. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She walked into the house that had never been her home, sat down in a corner, and waited to see what would happen next. The treasure was real. She could touch it, count it, wear the furs that kept her warm, but safety, real safety, was not in that chest. She was still in a house with people who wanted her dead. Nothing had really changed. That night, while Nastya slept or pretended to sleep, the stepmother made her decision. If the forest gave such wealth to her husband's worthless daughter, imagine what it would give to her own precious Marfusha. The stepmother didn't see a miracle when she looked at that treasure, didn't see a warning, didn't stop to wonder why a girl sent to die had returned richer than a princess. She saw opportunity. Her daughter was better than Nastya, better educated, better dressed, better mannered, better in every way that mattered. If some spirit of the forest rewarded certain qualities, and it must be something like that, some test the girl had passed, then Marfusha would pass it twice as easily, would receive twice the reward, would come back with enough gold to make them the richest family in the province. The stepmother wasn't stupid. She understood, in some dim way, that what had happened was supernatural, that forces beyond her understanding were at work. But she was also greedy, and greed has a way of overriding caution. She pulled her husband aside. "Tomorrow," she said, "you'll take my daughter to the same place." He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something like conscience flickered in his eyes. He'd seen what the forest was. He'd left his own child to die there. Did she really want to risk Marfusha? But the moment passed. He remembered who gave the orders in this household. He remembered the treasure in the next room. He remembered that agreeing was easier than fighting. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The stepmother smiled. She was already mentally spending the fortune that was coming. She had no idea what she was really sending her daughter into, no understanding of what Father Frost actually tested, what he actually valued, what his question truly meant. She'd raised Marfusha to be the opposite of everything he rewarded. She was sending her daughter to her death. Marfusha was not like Nastya. She'd never worked a day in her life, never felt real cold. She'd always had the spot by the fire, the warmest blankets, the best seat in the sleigh. Never been hungry, never been denied, never been told no by anyone who mattered. Her mother had made sure of that, had protected her from every discomfort, shielded her from every difficulty, taught her that she was special and the world existed to serve her needs. It never occurred to either of them that this was the worst possible preparation for meeting Father Frost. The morning of the journey, the stepmother bundled her daughter in the warmest clothes they had, Nastya's new furs, ironically, which the girl wasn't allowed to keep for herself. She packed food and drink for the wait. She gave Marfusha careful instructions. "Sit by the tree and wait. A spirit will come. An old man, I think, dressed in white. He'll ask you questions. Be nice. Answer politely, and you'll come back richer than we ever dreamed. Be nice. Answer politely." That was all the preparation she gave her daughter for facing a god. Marfusha nodded, barely listening. She was already imagining the treasure. The gold she would drape around her neck, the jewels that would sparkle in her hair, the look on everyone's faces when they saw how blessed she was, how favored by the spirits, how much better than her stupid stepsister. She climbed into the sleigh with a smile on her face. The father drove her to the same clearing, the same tree, the same spot where, just yesterday, his own daughter had nearly died. He didn't look at Marfusha the way he'd looked at Nastya. There was no guilt in his eyes. This wasn't his child. Her survival or death meant nothing to him. Marfusha climbed out, arranged herself prettily against the trunk of the tree, waved cheerfully as her stepfather drove away. This would be easy. This would be fun. An adventure with a guaranteed happy ending. 2 girls. Same forest. Same clearing. Same tree. But everything else was different. Nastya had been sent to die. She'd worn threadbare clothes and carried no food. She'd known, from the moment her father left, that she was meant to freeze, that no one was coming back for her, that her survival, if it happened at all, would be despite everything her family had done, not because of it. Marfusha had been sent to profit. She wore the finest furs. She had provisions. She knew her mother was waiting anxiously for her return, that her stepfather would come back for her, that this was a test she'd been set up to pass. The circumstances were identical. The contexts were completely different. And here's what the story understands that the stepmother didn't. Father Frost wasn't testing what you had. He was testing who you were. Nastya had arrived in the forest already broken, already humbled, already trained by years of suffering to accept what couldn't be changed, to endure what couldn't be escaped, to find stillness in the center of the storm. Marfusha arrived with expectations, with demands, with a lifetime of experience teaching her that discomfort was someone else's problem, that complaints got results, that the world would bend to accommodate her needs. She was about to discover that winter doesn't bend. The cold came immediately. Marfusha felt it and recoiled. Her entire life, someone had always been there to fix things, to light the fire, fetch the blanket, make the discomfort stop. Cold wasn't supposed to just happen. Not to her. Not without someone doing something about it. She pulled the furs tighter, ate some of the food she'd brought, waited for the spirit to arrive and give her what she deserved. The cold kept coming. Father Frost appeared at dusk, the same cracking, snapping approach through the trees, the same plummeting temperature, the same ancient figure emerging from the forest, like a fragment of the Ice Age given form. Marfusha watched him come with a mixture of impatience and annoyance. She'd been waiting for hours. She was cold and bored and hungry. The food she'd brought was gone now, and her stomach was growling. And here, finally, was the spirit who was supposed to give her treasure. It was about time. He stopped before her. Those pale, colorless eyes examined her with the same cold assessment he'd given Nastya. "Are you warm, my child?" Marfusha looked at this creature, this thing, whatever it was, and felt only irritation. She'd been sitting in the snow for hours. She'd expected this to be quick, expected the treasure to appear almost immediately, expected to be home by now counting her gold. Instead, she'd been left to freeze while this old man took his time showing up. "Are you blind?" she snapped. "Does it look like I'm warm? It's freezing out here. I've been waiting forever. Make it stop." Father Frost's expression didn't change. The temperature did. It dropped, sharply. The wind that had been still suddenly rose, driving ice crystals into her face. "And now?" he asked. "Are you warm now?" "No, I'm colder." What kind of stupid question is that? Marfusha was outraged now. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The spirit was supposed to reward her, not make things worse. "Go away and leave me alone, or just give me what you gave the other girl. I don't have time for these games." Colder still, the wind began to howl. Snow drove sideways, finding every gap in her borrowed furs. "Now, child, are you warm now?" "I told you, I'm freezing. Are you deaf as well as blind?" Marfusha had never been denied anything in her life, had never encountered a force that didn't bend to her complaints, her demands, her tantrums. "I hate this forest. I hate this cold. I hate you. Give me my treasure and let me go home." She didn't understand. She would never understand. Some forces don't negotiate. Father Frost looked at her for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in his face, no recognition of anything valued. Just the cold, indifferent assessment of winter itself regarding a creature that was utterly unsuited for survival. He didn't argue with her, didn't explain what she'd done wrong, didn't give her another chance. He simply made it colder and walked away. Marfusha screamed after him, cursed him, demanded he come back, threatened to tell her mother, as if mothers had any power here, as if any human had any authority in this place. Father Frost didn't turn around. He walked back into the forest, into the deepening darkness, and the killing cold walked with him. But this time, the cold didn't leave when he did. It stayed. It deepened. It intensified. Do you remember what I told you at the beginning? About what it feels like to freeze to death? Marfusha was about to find out. The shivering started first. Uncontrollable tremors racking her body, muscles desperately trying to generate heat. Her teeth chattered so hard she couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't even curse properly anymore. Then the shivering stopped, her body giving up on the extremities, her hands going numb, then white, then blue, her feet losing all sensation. The cold retreating to her core, trying to protect the vital organs. Confusion set in. She couldn't remember why she was angry, couldn't remember what she'd said to the old man, couldn't remember her mother's face, her own name, why any of this mattered. And then, the cruelest part, she started to feel warm. She tried to take off the furs, tried to strip away the layers that were suddenly suffocating her. The paradoxical undressing that claims so many victims, the final lie a dying body tells. She wanted to sleep, just lie down in the snow, just close her eyes for a moment, just rest. She did. She didn't wake up. When the stepmother sent for her daughter the next day, sent the father, because she couldn't be bothered to go herself, because she was too busy imagining how she'd spend the treasure, they found Marfusha sitting under the tree exactly where she had been left, frozen solid. Her face was twisted in an expression of outrage, mouth open mid-complaint, eyes wide with disbelief, still angry, even in death, at a world that had finally refused to give her what she demanded. The cold had preserved her perfectly, every detail fixed in place. The petulant set of her jaw, the furrow of her brow, the posture of someone who couldn't believe this was happening to her, who died still expecting someone to fix it. She would look that way forever now, a monument to entitlement, frozen in the moment of discovering that death doesn't care how special your mother thinks you are. The father loaded the body into the sleigh. There was no treasure this time, no furs, no gold, no reward, just a frozen girl who had failed a test she never understood. He drove home in silence. The stepmother saw the sleigh approaching, saw that there was no treasure chest gleaming beside her daughter, saw the shape under the blanket, too still, too stiff, too final. She ran out of the house, pulled back the blanket, and screamed. Her daughter, her precious Marfusha, the child she'd spoiled and protected and loved beyond all reason. Frozen, dead, gone, because she'd sent her into the forest to face a god, with no preparation except be nice and answer politely. The story doesn't tell us what happened to the stepmother after that. Doesn't say whether she learned anything, felt anything, changed in any way. Some versions have her dying of grief. Others have her simply continuing, living in the same house with Nastya, with all that treasure, with the knowledge of what she'd done. Justice in these old stories is inconsistent. Sometimes the wicked are punished. Sometimes they just have to live with themselves, which is worse. The story doesn't say. Let's step outside the story for a moment, because to truly understand what this tale meant to the people who told it, you need to understand what winter meant to them. And I don't mean what it means to us, an inconvenience, a reason to buy a heavier coat, something that makes the commute annoying. To our ancestors, winter was death, not metaphorical death, not poetic death, actual literal death arriving on schedule every November and staying until April took it away. I gave you numbers earlier: the Great Frost, the Little Ice Age, the mass graves of frozen dead. But those were the peaks, the catastrophes, the winters that were worse than usual. Even in a normal year, winter killed. In pre-industrial Europe, between 5 and 15% of the population died every winter. Every single winter. If you had a village of 100 people in October, you could expect to bury somewhere between 5 and 15 of them by spring. That was just normal. The baseline. The cost of surviving in a world where the cold couldn't be controlled. The elderly went first. Their bodies couldn't regulate temperature as well. Their immune systems couldn't fight off the illnesses that flourished in close quarters. They'd fall asleep by the fire and never wake up. Or they'd catch a cold that became pneumonia, that became death. Then the infants. Babies need warmth more than almost anything else. When the fire burned low, when the family couldn't afford enough fuel, when the cold crept into the cradle, babies died. Sometimes mothers would wake to find their children frozen beside them. Then anyone who got sick. In summer, you could survive a fever. Your body could burn hot without catastrophic consequence. In winter, illness was a death sentence. The energy your body spent fighting disease was energy it couldn't spend staying warm. Winter wasn't a season. It was a siege. Every year, the cold surrounded you, cut off your supplies, and waited to see who would survive. So how did anyone make it through? Not alone. That's the first thing you need to understand. No one survived winter alone. The rugged individualist, the lone wolf, the person who didn't need anyone else. They died, quickly and certainly, frozen in their isolated cabin or starved when their food ran out. Winter survival required community. You needed enough people to keep the fire burning all night, every night, for months on end. You needed enough people to gather fuel, to hunt when hunting was possible, to care for those who fell sick. You needed bodies, warm bodies, pressed together, sharing heat. A single person in a cabin would freeze. A family of 10 might make it. This is why hospitality was sacred in northern cultures. Why turning away a stranger in winter was considered one of the worst sins imaginable. When you refused shelter to a traveler, you weren't just being rude. You were killing them. The cold would do the actual work, but the death was on your hands. The social contracts of winter were absolute. You shared food, even when food was scarce. You shared warmth, even when warmth was precious. You took in relatives you didn't like and neighbors you barely knew, because the alternative was watching them die outside your door. Rationing wasn't optional. You harvested in autumn, and whatever you stored had to last until spring. If you ate too much in December, you starved in March. Families kept careful track of every grain, every dried vegetable, every piece of preserved meat. Waste was unthinkable. And sometimes, despite everything, the math didn't work. Sometimes there wasn't enough food for everyone. Sometimes parents watched their children grow thin and made impossible choices. Sometimes the elderly stopped eating quietly so there would be more for the young. Sometimes entire families decided, together, who would live and who would die. This was winter. Not a metaphor, not a fairy tale, reality. This is the context for Father Frost. He wasn't a fairy tale character to the people who told his stories. Not really. He was death personified. The spirit of the season that took your children, your parents, your livestock, your neighbors. The force that descended on your village every year and didn't leave until it had extracted its toll. You couldn't fight him, couldn't bargain with him, couldn't reason with him. The cold doesn't negotiate. Winter doesn't care about your feelings, your needs, your desperate desire to survive. All you could do was endure. And the stories about Father Frost were survival guides. Not guides to surviving Father Frost literally. Everyone knew he wasn't real. But guides to surviving winter. To surviving conditions that actively wanted to kill you. Think about what the Morozko story actually teaches. Nastia, the girl who survived, didn't fight the cold, didn't rage against it, didn't waste precious energy demanding that reality be different than it was. She accepted her situation, conserved her strength, maintained her composure, and endured. Marfusha, the girl who died, did the opposite. She fought, she raged, she demanded. She exhausted herself in futile resistance against something that couldn't be resisted. This isn't a lesson about manners. It's a lesson about survival psychology. The story was told to prepare children for what they would face. Not Father Frost specifically, but the cold itself. The weeks of darkness. The dwindling food supplies, the fear and the uncertainty and the very real possibility that this winter, this year, they might not make it. Don't panic, don't rage, don't exhaust yourself fighting the unfightable. Be still, conserve your strength, endure, and maybe, you'll survive to see spring. Modern research confirms what our ancestors knew instinctively. People who stay calm in emergencies live longer than people who panic. This isn't folk wisdom, it's documented fact. When you panic, your body dumps adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your heart rate spikes. Your breathing becomes rapid and shallow. Your muscles tense, ready to fight or flee. This response evolved to help us escape predators. Short, intense bursts of activity that get us out of danger. But you can't flee from cold. You can't fight winter. And the panic response, in conditions of extreme cold, will kill you. Here's why. Heat loss accelerates with activity. The more you move, the more heat you generate, but also the more heat you lose to the environment. Running around in freezing temperatures is like opening all the windows in your house while the heater runs. You're burning fuel without building warmth. Panic breathing makes it worse. When you breathe rapidly, you lose heat through your respiratory system. Cold air goes in, warm air comes out. Every frantic breath is a tiny robbery of the warmth you need to survive. And adrenaline itself is a problem. It redirects blood to your muscles, away from your core. In a fight or flight scenario, that makes sense. Your muscles need oxygen to run or punch. In a cold survival scenario, it's catastrophic. You're literally pulling warmth away from your vital organs and pushing it toward your extremities, where it will be lost to the environment. Calm, on the other hand, preserves you. Slow, deep breathing minimizes respiratory heat loss. Relaxed muscles generate less waste heat, but also lose less heat. Blood stays in your core, keeping your organs warm. Your body enters a kind of conservation mode, burning fuel efficiently, preserving what matters. The story of Father Frost encodes this knowledge. Nastya, staying calm, answering without panic, maintaining composure even as she freezes. She's doing exactly what a survival expert would recommend. Marfusha, raging and screaming and exhausting herself. She's accelerating her own death. Our ancestors didn't have the science, but they had thousands of years of observation. They watched who lived and who died. They noticed patterns, and they encoded what they learned into stories. Father Frost wasn't just mythology, he was a textbook. Morozko, Father Frost, is the most complete narrative version of this figure. The tale we've explored in various forms has been told across Russia for centuries. But he's not the only face that winter wears in Russian folklore. Sometimes he's called Ded Moroz, Grandfather Frost. Today, if you mention Ded Moroz to a Russian, they'll think of their version of Santa Claus. A jolly old man in a long blue coat, carrying a staff, traveling not by sleigh but by troika, a carriage pulled by 3 horses. He brings presents to children on New Year's Eve, accompanied by his granddaughter Snegorochka, the snow maiden. But this is a recent invention. A Soviet-era transformation that took an ancient terror and made it safe for state-sponsored celebration. The original Ded Moroz was no gift giver. In the oldest traditions, he was a winter demon, a spirit of killing cold. Parents didn't tell children that Ded Moroz would bring them presents if they were good. They warned children that Ded Moroz would freeze them if they misbehaved. He was the boogeyman of December, the threat that kept children inside during the dangerous months, kept them from wandering into the forest, kept them close to the fire where they belonged. He didn't reward good children. He punished bad ones with ice, with cold, with death. The presents, the jolliness, the grandfather imagery, all of that came later, when central heating made winter survivable, when the Communist Party needed a secular alternative to religious Christmas celebrations, when the terror that had sustained the stories for centuries simply wasn't needed anymore. But in the old songs, the old poems, the old stories whispered by grandmothers to keep children from wandering outside, Ded Moroz was death, pure and simple, the face that winter wore when it came to collect its toll. Ded Moroz's companion, Snegorochka, the snow maiden, has her own story, and it's every bit as dark as the tale of Father Frost. In the oldest versions, Snegorochka wasn't Ded Moroz's granddaughter. She was something stranger, something more tragic. She was a girl made of snow. An elderly couple, childless and lonely, built her in their yard one winter. They shaped her from the fresh white snow, carefully, lovingly, with all the tenderness they had never been able to give to a real child. They gave her eyes of coal and a mouth of berries. They dressed her in scraps of cloth, and by some miracle, some magic of winter, she came to life. She was their daughter now, their snow daughter. She moved into their cottage and brought them joy beyond anything they dared to hope for. She was kind, gentle, beautiful, perfect in the way that only magical things can be perfect. But she was still made of snow, still a creature of cold, and she had one weakness that would prove fatal. She couldn't feel warmth without melting. The story follows her as she grows up. As she watches the village children play in summer and longs to join them, but can't because the heat would destroy her. As she observes the young couples walking hand in hand, laughing, touching, falling in love, and feels something stirring in her frozen heart that she doesn't understand. Winter was her time. When the cold returned, she was strong, vibrant, alive. But every spring she had to hide. Every summer was a prison. She watched the world from the shadows, always apart, never able to fully belong. And then she fell in love. A shepherd boy, kind, handsome, warm-blooded, everything she isn't and can never be. She loved him with an intensity that surprised her. This girl made of ice, feeling heat for the first time. Real heat. The warmth of emotion, of desire, of human connection. And the heat destroyed her. In some versions, she melts the first time she feels genuine love. The emotion itself is warm enough to undo her. In others, she leaps over a bonfire to join the summer celebrations with the other young people, wanting so desperately to be part of their world that she forgets, for one fatal moment, what she is. The flames take her. In all versions, she dies, dissolves into water, into mist, into nothing. Her old parents find a puddle where their daughter stood. The shepherd boy calls her name and hears only the wind. What's the lesson here? Don't leave your element. Don't want what you can't have. Don't fall in love if love will destroy you. Or maybe simply this: winter and warmth cannot coexist. One will always destroy the other. And if you're made of cold, you'd better learn to accept that, or the things you love will kill you. The name Jack Frost likely derives from Norse mythology. The Vikings called him Jökull Frosty, a name that translates roughly to icicle frost. Not a sprite, not a playful figure, a being associated with the primordial cold that existed before the world was made. The Norse didn't tell gentle stories about winter. They came from Scandinavia, where the cold lasted most of the year and survival was never guaranteed. Their mythology reflected this. They believed in Jotunheim, the realm of the frost giants, beings of primordial ice who existed before the gods, before humanity, before warmth itself. They were old when Odin was young. They remember the time before fire, before light, before the sun first rose to push back the endless dark. In Norse cosmology, the frost giants are enemies of everything warm and alive. They're locked in eternal conflict with the gods of Asgard, always threatening to overwhelm the worlds of gods and men, always waiting for the moment when they can return everything to the frozen void from which it came. This wasn't just metaphor to the Vikings. They lived with the real possibility that winter might win, that one year the cold would come and never leave, that the ice would advance and keep advancing, that the fragile warmth humanity had carved out of the frozen darkness might simply go out. Ragnarok The end of the world in Norse mythology begins with Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter. 3 years of cold with no summer in between. The sun swallowed, the world frozen solid. Then, and only then, do the other catastrophes begin. The wars, the monsters, the final battle between gods and giants. For the Norse, the end of all things started with ice. Winter wasn't just a season to survive. It was an apocalypse waiting to happen. The end of everything, pushing a little closer every December. Winter nights brought other terrors beyond the cold itself. The wild hunt, a procession of ghostly hunters riding across the night sky during the darkest months of the year. They appear in folklore across Northern Europe, Germanic, Norse, Celtic, Slavic. The details vary, but the core remains the same. A spectral host led by a terrifying figure, sometimes Odin, the All-Father himself, riding his 8-legged horse through the clouds. Sometimes Herne the Hunter, a ghostly figure with antlers growing from his skull. Sometimes a demon, or a dead king, or a figure so ancient no one remembered his original name. The hunt rode with howling hounds, great black dogs with eyes like burning coals, whose baying could be heard miles away. They were accompanied by the souls of the dead, the damned, the restless, all those who had died with unfinished business, conscripted into the eternal chase. If you saw them, you were in danger. Some stories say that witnessing the wild hunt would drive you mad. The human mind couldn't process what it was seeing. This glimpse of something beyond the mortal world. You'd spend the rest of your life haunted by what you'd seen, unable to forget the riders in the sky. Others say you'd be swept up and forced to join the procession, riding with the dead until you became one of them. Your body might be found the next morning, cold and stiff, with a look of terror frozen on your face, or it might never be found at all. Still others say the hunt would simply take you, body and soul, carrying you off to whatever dark realm they called home. Your family would search for you. They'd find nothing, and eventually they'd stop searching. The wild hunt rode in winter, always in winter, when the nights were longest and the darkness was deepest and the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Our ancestors huddled by their fires on winter nights, listening to the wind howl outside, and told stories about what was riding in that wind. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a procession of the dead. The thunder wasn't just noise, it was hoofbeats in the sky. Stay inside, stay by the fire, stay quiet. Don't draw their attention. Winter wasn't just cold, it was haunted. The dead moved freely in those dark months, and the living had to hide until spring brought safety. Across Slavic cultures, Russian, Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, Serbian, winter spirits took different forms, but they shared common traits. They were ancient, they were hungry, and they came for the living when the cold grew deep. In some regions, the frost was controlled by Marana, a goddess of winter and death. Not death in battle, not death by violence or disease, death by cold, death by darkness, the quiet death that comes in the night when the fire goes out and the temperature drops and you simply never wake up. Marana was ancient. She existed before the gods that would later supplant her, before Christianity came and turned her into a demon, before anyone thought to write down her stories. She was primal, elemental, the cold itself, given form and will and appetite. Her names changed across regions: Marzana in Poland, Morena in Czech lands, Mara in Serbian tradition. But she was always the same figure, the Queen of Winter, the Lady of Death, the white goddess who walked through villages and left frozen corpses in her wake. And every winter, she grew stronger. As the days shortened and the nights lengthened, Morana's power waxed. She reached out from her frozen realm, touching the mortal world with killing fingers. Every death from cold fed her. Every life extinguished by frost made her stronger. By midwinter, she was at her peak, a goddess of death in her full terrible glory. Other Slavic traditions featured lesser frost demons, malevolent spirits who served winter's purposes. They weren't gods exactly, but they were dangerous. They lived in the spaces between, in drafts that crept under doors, in the frost that formed on windows, in the sudden cold that made you shiver even by the fire. You could try to appease them. You might leave out food for the frost demons, milk frozen solid, bread that would keep for days in the killing cold. Maybe they would take the offering and spare your family. Maybe they would take it and kill you anyway. You never knew. You just did what you could and hoped, performed the rituals, said the prayers, made the offerings, and waited to see if morning would come. Morana was burned in effigy every spring. Villagers would construct a figure of straw and cloth, dress it in winter garments, the white of snow, the grey of ice, and set it ablaze as the ice began to melt. The whole community would gather. There would be singing, dancing, celebration, the kind of raw, overwhelming joy that only comes after genuine fear, after months of uncertainty, after the real possibility of death. They'd burn winter. They'd beaten her. She'd tried to kill them, and they'd survived. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't a quaint folk tradition to be photographed by tourists and documented by anthropologists. This was desperate gratitude from people who had genuinely expected to die and somehow hadn't. The ritual varied by region, but the emotion was always the same. Some villagers would throw the burning effigy into rivers, drowning the goddess of cold, watching the water carry away the remains of the season that had tried to kill them. The fire hissed and steamed as it met the cold water. The crowd cheered. Their enemy was defeated. Some would scatter the ashes on the fields, turning death into fertilizer, transforming the enemy into something useful. The same goddess who had frozen their crops and killed their livestock would now help grow the spring wheat. There was poetry in that, and practicality. Some would carry the burning effigy through the streets, parading it past every house, letting everyone see that winter was dying. Children would follow, laughing and shouting. Adults would weep with relief. The old, who had been so close to death themselves, would watch with particular intensity. Maslenitsa, the week-long celebration before Lent, incorporates these ancient rituals. Even today, some Russian villages burn a straw figure to mark the end of winter. The tradition has been softened, secularized, turned into a cultural curiosity, but the bones of the original ritual remain. Our ancestors celebrated the end of winter because survival was not guaranteed. The feasting and drinking and dancing weren't just entertainment, they were survivors' euphoria. The visceral, physical relief of having made it through. They'd earned this. They'd paid for it in fear and hunger and cold. in neighbors buried and children lost, in the weight of uncertainty that pressed down on them for months, another year, against all odds. Despite the cold's best efforts to claim them, they'd earned the right to celebrate, and they did, with fire and joy and the fierce gratitude of those who know exactly how close they came to dying. Jack Frost, as most of the English-speaking world knows him, is largely an English creation, and his transformation from terror to toy tells us something important about how humanity's relationship with winter has changed. In medieval England, Jack Frost was dangerous. Poems and songs from this period describe him as a killer, a figure who destroys crops, slaughters livestock, brings death to the elderly and the young. Farmers feared him. Parents warned children about him. He was as much a threat as wolves or bandits or plague. But starting in the 17th and 18th centuries, something shifted. England industrialized. Cities grew. People moved into buildings with better insulation, better heating, better protection against the elements. For the first time in human history, significant portions of the population lived lives where winter was uncomfortable, but not lethal. And Jack Frost began to change. By the Victorian era, he appears in children's books as a mischievous sprite. He paints frost patterns on windows, pretty pictures for children to admire from the warm side of the glass. He makes noses red and cheeks rosy. He's annoying perhaps on cold mornings, but harmless, even cute. By the 20th century, he's a cartoon, a holiday decoration, a line in a Christmas song that nobody really thinks about. Jack Frost nipping at your nose. We sing it without thinking about what it means, without picturing the frostbite, the blackening skin, the amputations that followed before modern medicine, without remembering that nipping is the first stage of tissue death, the warning sign that if ignored, leads to fingers and toes turning black and falling off. We made Jack Frost cute because we no longer fear him. Central heating and insulated walls and global supply chains have made winter an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. We can laugh at frost now because it can't hurt us. But the old stories remain, and if you read them with fresh eyes, knowing what winter used to mean, you can still feel the terror that created them. Let's return to the Morozko story now. Back to that household where everything began. Father Frost killed one girl and spared another. He's the supernatural element, the magical figure, the being from beyond the ordinary world. In most retellings, he's positioned as either the hero, rewarding virtue, or the villain, punishing rudeness with death. But was he really the villain? Think about what he actually did. He appeared in the forest. He asked a simple question. He gave both girls the same test. He treated them with perfect equality, judging them by identical standards, applying the same criteria to each. He was fair. In his own terrible way, he was absolutely fair. The villain, the real villain, is the father. A man who took his own daughter into the forest, who looked her in the eyes and told her to wait, who drove away knowing she would die, who came back the next morning expecting to collect a corpse. And why did he do this? Not because he hated his daughter, not because she'd wronged him in some way, not because he thought she deserved to die. He did it because his wife told him to, because it was easier than arguing, because the path of least resistance led through his child's murder, and he wasn't strong enough to choose a harder path. When Nastya survived, when she came back alive and wealthy, he didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't acknowledge what he'd done. He just loaded the treasure into the sleigh and drove home as if nothing had happened. The story gives him no punishment, no reckoning, no consequence at all. Just a man who committed attempted murder against his own child and got away with it completely because the victim refused to die. The father represents a type, a specific kind of evil that's far more common than we like to admit. Not the evil of active malice, not the evil of cruelty, of sadism, of taking pleasure in others' suffering. That kind of evil is rare, thankfully. Most people aren't monsters in the dramatic sense. The evil of passivity, the evil of weakness, the evil of men who commit atrocities not because they want to, but because they don't have the strength to refuse. History is full of such men, the guards who operated the machinery of genocide, not because they hated their victims, but because refusing orders was hard and obeying them was easy. The bureaucrats who signed deportation papers without thinking about where the trains were going. The neighbors who watched families being dragged from their homes and said nothing, did nothing, because involvement would have been inconvenient. They didn't hold the knives, they didn't pull the triggers, they just enabled, made things possible, removed obstacles, looked the other way, and afterward, they told themselves they weren't responsible. Their hands were clean. They didn't kill anyone. They just failed to save them. There's a difference, isn't there? The father in our story is this type of man. He didn't want his daughter to die. He didn't hate her. He just wasn't willing to endure conflict to save her. And when she survived anyway, he felt nothing. Not relief, not guilt, not love. Just greed when he saw the treasure. The story doesn't punish him because the world often doesn't punish such men. They slip through. They survive. They live out their lives surrounded by the consequences of their cowardice, and they never acknowledge what they've done. This is the most common kind of evil and the most insidious. The stepmother is easier to hate. Her malice is obvious. She wanted Nastya dead and she arranged for it to happen. But her crime goes deeper than attempted murder. When her plan failed, she didn't repent, didn't reconsider, didn't wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd done something wrong. She looked at the miracle of her stepdaughter's survival, looked at evidence that something supernatural had intervened, that forces beyond her understanding were at work, and her first thought was profit. Send my daughter to the same place. We'll get twice the treasure. She sent Marfusha into the same death trap that should have killed Nastya. She sent her own biological child, her flesh and blood, into a frozen forest to face a god of winter. And Marfusha died. But here's the thing. The stepmother killed her daughter long before Father Frost ever touched her. Think about who Marfusha was. Why she failed the test that Nastya passed. She was spoiled, entitled, incapable of enduring discomfort, unable to control her emotions even when her life depended on it. Who made her that way? The stepmother did. Years of spoiling and coddling, years of telling Marfusha she was special, that she deserved comfort, that hardship was something that happened to other people. Years of protecting her from every difficulty, shielding her from every consequence, ensuring she never developed the resilience she would need to survive. Marfusha died because she'd never been allowed to suffer, never been taught that the world doesn't care about her feelings, never learned that reality doesn't negotiate. Her mother raised her to be helpless, then sent her into a situation where helplessness was fatal. The stepmother murdered both girls. She just used different weapons. For Nastya, she used the forest and the cold. For Marfusha, she used her own parenting. Nastya survived. That's the happy ending, supposedly. The good girl wins. Virtue is rewarded. The audience goes home satisfied. But let's think about what survival required. She had to sit in killing cold and pretend to be warm. Had to lie to a supernatural being repeatedly while her body froze. Had to maintain composure and courtesy while literally dying. Had to suppress every natural human response. The complaints, the pleas, the desperate need for help, and present a mask of cheerful acceptance. She had to have no visible needs, no demands, no expectations. She had to be perfectly pleasant while being perfectly destroyed. Is that a lesson? Or is it a warning? Because there's another way to read this story, not as a celebration of virtue, but as a handbook for surviving abuse. Think about Nastia's life before the forest, living with a stepmother who hated her, a father who wouldn't protect her, a household where she was worked like a servant and treated like a burden, where the slightest complaint would bring punishment, where her only survival strategy was to be invisible, useful, and uncomplaining. She'd been training for Father Frost her whole life. The forest was just another place where the wrong word, the wrong expression, the wrong display of need could get her killed. Another hostile environment where survival meant hiding who you really were and feeling only what you were allowed to feel. She survived the god of cold because she'd spent years surviving her stepmother. The skills transferred perfectly. And what are those skills exactly? Don't complain, no matter how much you're suffering. Don't ask for help, no matter how desperately you need it. Don't let anyone see your pain. Smile through agony. Say you're fine when you're dying. Make yourself small and pleasant and agreeable. And maybe the thing that has power over you will decide to let you live. That's not virtue. That's trauma. What happens after the story ends? The versions don't say. They leave us with Nastia alive and wealthy, the stepmother grieving, the father presumably continuing as he always has, weak, passive, unchanged. But think about what comes next. Nastia has to live in that house, with the father who tried to kill her, with the stepmother who ordered her death. She has treasure now, yes, gold and jewels and furs beyond imagining. But treasure doesn't buy safety. It doesn't buy love. It doesn't heal the wounds of betrayal. Can she trust them? Can she sleep at night knowing what they're capable of? Every kindness they show her now, is it genuine? Or is it just the greed, the hope of getting their hands on her treasure? Every argument, every tension, every flash of anger in her stepmother's eyes, does it make her wonder if they're planning something new? Does she stay? Does she leave? Does she use her newfound wealth to escape, to start a new life somewhere else? Or is she trapped, too young to leave, too traumatized to imagine anything different, too conditioned by years of abuse to believe she deserves better? Some versions of the story have Nastia marrying a prince. The treasure attracts a wealthy suitor, and she escapes into a new life of luxury and safety. The fairy tale ending, complete with a castle and a crown. But even in those versions, the question lingers. What does she carry with her? You don't survive what Nastia survived without scars. The hypervigilance that never quite fades. The inability to trust anyone completely, even people who love you. The reflexive people-pleasing. The compulsive need to make everyone happy. The terror of expressing any negative emotion. The way you flinch when someone raises their voice. The nightmares that come without warning. The flashbacks triggered by cold, by forests, by the sound of a sleigh in the snow, the certainty deep in your bones that safety is always temporary, that the other shoe is always about to drop, that the people who claim to love you might be planning your destruction even as they smile. She survived, but survival isn't the same as healing, isn't the same as thriving, isn't the same as being okay. The story gives us a happy ending and expects us to be satisfied. Girl lives, girl gets rich, girl escapes her terrible family, happily ever after. But endings are complicated, and the damage we carry doesn't disappear just because the immediate threat is gone. It lives in our bodies. It shapes our choices. It colors every relationship, every decision, every moment of happiness with the shadow of what came before. Nastya won. But what did winning cost her? The story doesn't say. It never does. Fairy tales are interested in survival, not recovery, in victory, not healing. They end at the moment of triumph and leave us to imagine everything that comes after. Maybe that's merciful. Maybe we don't want to know what happened to Nastya in the years after her ordeal. Maybe the happily ever after is kinder than the truth. Or maybe we need to know. Maybe stories about trauma should include stories about healing. Maybe the girls who survive deserve to have their afterwards told too. But that's a different story, one the old versions never bothered to tell. We've traveled far tonight, from the frozen forests of ancient Russia to the mythology of the Vikings, from Slavic demons to English sprites, from a world where winter was an annual apocalypse to one where it's an inconvenience we barely notice. And through it all, one figure has walked beside us, changing his face, changing his name, but always representing the same thing, the cold that kills. Today, Jack Frost is a cartoon, a decoration, a line in a song you hear at shopping malls in December, sandwiched between advertisements for things you don't need and announcements of sales you don't care about. Jack Frost nipping at your nose. We sing it without thinking about what it means, without remembering the frostbite, the blackening skin, the amputations, without picturing the children who wandered too far from home and were found in the spring, preserved by the very cold that killed them. We've tamed him, made him harmless, turned terror into a mascot. It happened gradually, over centuries. As we got better at surviving winter, winter got less scary, and the stories we told about it changed to reflect our new relationship. Father Frost stopped being a killer and became a gift giver. The spirits of cold stopped demanding offerings and started granting wishes. The terror faded into nostalgia. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a sign of progress, proof that we've conquered something that dominated human existence for millennia. We don't have to fear winter anymore. Central heating and insulated walls and global supply chains have made the cold into a minor inconvenience for most of us. We've won. But the old stories remember what we've forgotten. They carry the weight of all those winters, all those deaths, all those desperate prayers for spring that sometimes went unanswered. They're fossils of fear, preserved evidence of what our ancestors endured. And if we listen to them carefully, if we read them with the right eyes, we can still hear the cold. We can still feel the chill on our necks, still sense the presence of something ancient and patient, waiting just beyond the firelight. Father Frost hasn't been destroyed. He's just been contained, pushed back, made into a story we tell children to give them a pleasant shiver, not the genuine terror that kept our ancestors awake at night. But he remembers what he was, and so should we. Not everyone has escaped Father Frost. Every winter, even now, people die of cold. In the richest nations on earth, in cities with more wealth than medieval kingdoms could have imagined, people freeze to death. The homeless, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, trying to survive nights that would kill them without the shelters that are often full, the warming centers that close too early, the compassion that's often in short supply. They wrap themselves in whatever they can find. They huddle over heating grates. They make themselves small, trying to conserve warmth, and sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes their bodies are found in the morning, frozen, peaceful, finally warm in the only way that death allows. The elderly, in apartments where the heating is broken or the bills are too high, making impossible choices between warmth and food. They turn down the thermostat to save money. They pile on blankets that aren't quite enough. They go to bed early, hoping sleep will carry them through the coldest hours. Sometimes they don't wake up. The rural poor in houses with inadequate insulation, burning whatever they can find to keep the cold at bay. Wood when they can get it. Kerosene heaters that fill the air with dangerous fumes. Space heaters that overload old wiring and start fires. Whatever works, whatever's available, whatever keeps them alive one more night. The migrants, crossing borders in winter, braving mountain passes and frozen rivers because the dangers behind them are worse than the dangers ahead. They die in the Alps, trying to reach Europe. They die in the desert, where nights turn deadly cold. They die in the backs of trucks, packed together, praying for warmth that doesn't come. And beyond the borders of the comfortable world, the places where central heating hasn't reached, where electricity is unreliable, where poverty means living the way our ancestors lived, Father Frost still walks freely. He still asks his question. He still takes those who can't answer correctly. We've built walls between ourselves and winter. Walls of technology and infrastructure and accumulated wealth. Most of us live our entire lives without ever facing the cold the way our ancestors did. We've won the war against winter, or at least we've won it for ourselves. But the walls aren't universal. They have gaps, cracks, places where the cold gets through. The poor, the homeless, the desperate, they slip through those cracks. They face the old enemy with few defenses. And they die, every year, in the richest countries on earth. Father Frost hasn't been defeated. He's been contained, pushed to the margins, made into someone else's problem. But he's still out there, still patient, still waiting. And if the systems we've built ever fail, if the power goes out, if the supply chains break, if the walls we've constructed crumble, he'll be right there. The same as he ever was. The same as he's always been. Asking his question, just like he did in the frozen forests of Russia 1,000 years ago. Somewhere in those old tales, in the mythology we've left behind, there's a girl sitting under a tree in a frozen forest. Her father has abandoned her. Her stepmother has sentenced her to death. And something ancient is walking toward her through the trees, cracking, snapping, cold, beyond cold, coming to ask a question that will determine whether she lives or dies. Are you warm, my child? And she has to answer correctly, has to find the right words, the right tone, the right mask to wear. One wrong answer, and she joins the frozen dead. That's the real Jack Frost. Not a sprite, not a cartoon, a test you didn't ask for, administered by something that doesn't care about you, with death as the penalty for failure. Our ancestors knew him well. They told stories about him, not to entertain, but to prepare. To teach their children that winter was an enemy, that the cold couldn't be reasoned with, or bargained with, or charmed, that the only way to survive was to endure, to be calm when everything in you screamed to panic, to be still when everything in you wanted to run, to say, "I'm warm enough," when you were freezing to death. We've forgotten those lessons, mostly. We don't need them anymore. But every year, winter still comes. The temperature still drops. People still die of exposure. The homeless, the elderly, the unlucky few who find themselves in the wrong place without protection. And in the statistics of those deaths, in the frost that forms on windows, in the cold that nips at your nose on a January morning, Father Frost is still there, still ancient, still waiting, still asking his question. The only difference is that now, most of us don't have to answer. Stay warm out there, wherever you are. Keep the fires burning. Remember the old stories, even if you don't need them anymore. And if you ever find yourself alone in the cold, facing something you can't fight and can't escape, remember what Nastya knew. Don't rage, don't panic, don't waste your strength on the unfightable. Be still, endure, and say, with whatever conviction you can muster, "I'm warm enough." Until next time, sweet dreams.